On the 28th of May, 2013, a 28-year-old man wearing a rubber horsehead mask jumped into a powerful, churning whirlpool to film a video for his YouTube channel. His friend filmed from the harbor wall above, laughing as the man in the mask made neighing sounds and swirled around in the vortex. But then, the man decided he wanted a more dramatic shot. He took his camera, dove beneath the surface to film the whirlpool from below, and he vanished. And what happened in the next few minutes would reveal the terrifying hidden power of the water he loved so much. Okay, let's get into today's story. Jacob Cockle had always loved the water. It was just in his blood. He grew up in a coastal town called Penzance in the United Kingdom, and from the moment he could walk, he was drawn to the ocean. He spent pretty much all of his time surfing at one of the local beaches. By the time he was just 10 years old, he was already so obsessed that he started skipping school to go catch waves. Naturally, this got him into a whole lot of trouble with his parents and his teachers. They just couldn't understand why he would throw away his education for the ocean. But through all the arguments and the frustrations, there was always one person who completely understood him, one person who always had his back. And that was his older sister, Grace. Jacob and Grace were incredibly close. They were more than just siblings, they were best friends. They even developed their own special secret language that they would use to talk to each other. Jacob used it so often, in fact, that some people who overheard him actually thought he had a speech problem. But it was just their private world, a bond that no one else could break. When Jacob was 17, his world was shattered. Grace was diagnosed with a brain tumor. It was aggressive and fast-moving, and she passed away very quickly after the diagnosis. This loss had a profound and irreversible impact on Jacob. It was like his entire view of the world had shifted overnight. He started to believe something very personal and powerful, that Grace's energy, her spirit, hadn't just disappeared. He felt it had been transferred directly to him. He came to believe that it was now his solemn duty to live for both of them, to experience everything the world had to offer for himself and for his sister. This new belief translated into a new way of living. Jacob began taking more and more risks. He felt like he couldn't pass up any opportunity, no matter how dangerous. He wanted to live life to its absolute fullest, even if that meant being a little bit reckless. Alongside his love for the water, Jacob also had a deep passion for photography. And so he combined these two loves with his new risk-taking attitude. He started performing incredible water-based stunts and filming himself while he did them. He would go surfing in the middle of violent storms, paddling out into waves that would send most experienced surfers running for the shore. He would leap off of tall buildings into water that was alarmingly shallow. He would go free diving to dangerous depths, holding his breath for minutes at a time just to capture the perfect shot. And Jacob absolutely loved it. He loved the adrenaline, he loved the challenge, and he loved capturing these heart-stopping moments on film. He decided this was what he was meant to do. This was going to be his career. He was going to become a world-famous photographer who specialized in capturing the most dangerous and beautiful images the ocean had to offer. To keep himself focused, Jacob got a huge piece of paper and taped it to his bedroom wall. In big, bold black marker, he wrote himself a reminder, a mantra. I will become a world-famous photographer, and I will let nothing stand in my way. He meant it literally. He was prepared to go to any length, to face any danger, to get the shots he needed to build his career and honor his sister's memory. And this intense, unwavering attitude actually worked. By his early 20s, Jacob was already making a name for himself. He had won major photography awards from prestigious organizations like National Geographic and the Sunday Times. He became a regular contributor to major surf magazines, and his photos almost always landed on the cover. Most of his award-winning pictures were of the sea in its most violent and turbulent forms. He had an eye for capturing the raw power of nature. One of his most famous shots was of a fishing boat struggling to get back into port through a massive swell during a storm. That photo won a competition that led to it being displayed all over the London Underground, seen by millions of people. Another incredible shot he took was off the coast of Sumatra, way out in the middle of the open ocean. Jacob and his friend were in the water, right in front of a massive supertanker that was bearing down on them. His friend was surfing the huge wake created by the ship. It was an unbelievably dangerous picture to take, but it won him an award run by the Guardian newspaper. Jacob wasn't interested in the money for its own sake. Any money he earned from these competitions, he immediately spent on better photography equipment. If he was ever given a physical prize, like a brand new television, he would just give it away to one of his friends. All he cared about was getting back out there, living life on the edge, taking crazy chances, and capturing those experiences on film. There was one particular crazy experience that he had always wanted to capture on film, and it happened right in his own hometown of Penzance. A few times a year, a very strong and very distinct whirlpool would appear in a harbor right near his childhood home. The whirlpool wasn't a natural phenomenon, it was a quirk of engineering. It was designed to keep the harbor from silting up with sand and sediment. At high tide, water would rush into the harbor and hit a large concrete structure called a quay wall. At the bottom of this wall was a large tunnel that fed into another separate pool of water on the other side. So, as the tide came in, this secondary pool would fill up with water. Then, when the tide started to go out during low tide, the water in the main harbor would drain away, and the water from the filled-up pool would slowly filter back out through that same tunnel. This outflow of water was designed to push all the silt and sand out of the harbor, keeping it deep enough for boats. But sometimes, especially during very high tides, the water would come into the harbor so quickly that it would build up against the quay wall much faster than it could drain through the tunnel into the pool. When this happened, it created the same effect you see in your bathtub when you pull the plug. As all that excess water was forced down and sucked through the narrow tunnel, it would create a huge, powerful whirlpool that you could see spinning on the surface right next to the quay wall. This whirlpool only formed a couple of times a year, but it was incredibly dangerous. There were caution signs posted all around the edge of the harbor and on the quay wall itself, warning people to stay out of the water. But in his mid-20s, Jacob started ignoring those signs. Every time the whirlpool formed, he started jumping into it. He found that if he was careful, he could swirl around the outside edge of the vortex. He would film it from inside and just on the surface. He would upload these videos to YouTube, and they went viral, getting millions and millions of views. The footage was breathtakingly beautiful and absolutely terrifying at the same time. On the 28th of May 2013, Jacob was 28 years old. He noticed that the whirlpool was back in his hometown harbor, and he knew he had to go out and film it again. He ran over to his friend David's house and asked him to come down to the harbor and film him from the quay wall while he was inside the whirlpool. By the time David gathered his things and made his way down to the harbor, he looked over the edge of the wall and saw that Jacob was already in the water, swirling around in the vortex. David also noticed something strange. Jacob was wearing a rubber horsehead mask. When David asked him why, Jacob yelled up that it would be more eye-catching on YouTube, that it would help the video get more views. So, David leaned over the wall and started filming as Jacob, in his horse mask, swirled around and around in the whirlpool, making neighing sounds for the camera. After a few minutes of this, Jacob stopped and tried to swim away from the whirlpool. But you could see just how strong the pull of the water was. Even with swimming flippers on his feet, Jacob really struggled to get away from the vortex. He was in good spirits about it, though. He was laughing and talking to David, saying how when he first jumped in, this particular whirlpool was actually pretty scary. He told David it was definitely the strongest one he had ever been in at that spot. David agreed, yelling down, "Yeah, I can tell from up here, that one's really strong." For the next 10 to 15 minutes, David and Jacob joked back and forth about the whirlpool's strength. Jacob would put his horse mask back on, swirl around inside the vortex for a bit, then swim out again. Towards the end of the video David was filming, Jacob yelled up that he had one more thing in mind that he wanted to do. He wanted to dive down below the surface and film the whirlpool from underneath. He asked David to hand his camera down to him. David handed it down. You can see on the video Jacob adjusting the settings on his camera. And then he took a deep breath and dove below the surface to begin filming the underwater vortex. David, up on the quay wall, was watching him. He was very familiar with the kinds of things Jacob did. He knew Jacob was an incredible swimmer and had a great ability to hold his breath for a long time. But after a couple of minutes passed and Jacob still hadn't re-emerged, David started to get scared. He started yelling his name. When Jacob still didn't come up, David panicked. He turned and ran to the other side of the quay wall, the side that looked down into the secondary pool. He looked over the railing and he could see the water still rushing into the pool from the tunnel, but there was no sign of Jacob. He ran back and forth a couple of times, scanning the water on both sides of the wall. He couldn't see Jacob anywhere. Finally, he went back to the poolside one more time and looked down. and that's when he saw him. Jacob was down below, lying face down in the water, motionless. David scrambled down and waded out to him, but it was already too late. Jacob had drowned. The reason Jacob was always able to swirl around at the top of the whirlpool without getting pulled under was because he was wearing a wetsuit. Wetsuits are naturally buoyant. They help you float. But as you go deeper underwater, the water pressure increases and pushes against your wetsuit. This compression reduces the overall buoyancy of the suit. So, when Jacob dove down into this extremely powerful whirlpool, the immense pressure of the water pushed against his suit, and he lost his buoyancy. He was no longer floating. At that point, he got caught up in the powerful current of the whirlpool, and he was slowly but surely pulled down towards the bottom. He probably fought as hard as he could, trying to swim back to the surface, but the force was too great. Eventually, he was forced into the opening of that tunnel underneath the quay wall. He was trapped under there until he ran out of air and drowned. His body was then eventually spit out of the tunnel on the other side into the pool where his friend David found him. From a very young age, Carrie O'Connor had an intense and passionate love of learning. When she first learned how to read, her parents had to practically bribe her just to get her to put her book down so she would go outside and play with the other kids. While Carrie loved to learn about everything, her absolute favorite subject was French culture. She began devouring all things French, the history, the art, the food. In middle school, she began studying the language, and by the time she was in high school, she was nearly fluent and was already taking college-level French courses. Carrie's passion never wavered. She would go on to earn several degrees in French, culminating in a PhD. And in 2019, she was finally able to put that PhD to its intended use when she was offered a full-time professorship at Boston University. She was thrilled and eagerly accepted the role. After her first full year teaching at BU, she decided it was time to get an apartment that was closer to the campus. So, in August of 2020, shortly after her 38th birthday, Carrie, along with her two beloved cats, moved into an old apartment building on a busy street, just a 10-minute walk from Boston University. Even with her new apartment, still filled with unopened moving boxes and furniture still wrapped in plastic, Carrie's first priority was her students. She sat down at her laptop and enthusiastically wrote an email to all of her students for the upcoming year. The subject line was "The Joy of Learning French." In the email, her students could immediately see her incredible passion for the French language and just how excited she was about the new academic year. A few weeks later, on Monday, September 14th, Carrie was back at her apartment building after a day of classes. She had just purchased a brand new piece of furniture and she was trying to get it up to her apartment. This piece of furniture wasn't assembled yet. All the parts and the instructions were inside a single large box. This box was 7 feet tall, about a foot wide, and weighed just under 80 pounds. So, it was both heavy and incredibly awkward to handle. Carrie managed to get this huge box out of her car at street level and then hauled it all the way through the front doors of her apartment building and into the first floor lobby. She leaned the box up against the wall and then pressed the call button for the elevator. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to have a basic understanding of how the elevator in Carrie's old building worked. It was an older model. Once the elevator car arrived at your floor, you would have to manually slide open a big heavy door called the hoistway door. On the other side of that, you would see the elevator car itself, and on the car, there was yet another door. This one was called the car gate. It was a metal accordion-style gate that you also had to slide to the side by hand. But unlike the outer hoistway door, this inner car gate had a critical safety feature. It had to be shut all the way in order for the elevator to be able to move between floors. So, when the light dinged in the first floor lobby, signaling the elevator's arrival, Carrie opened up the heavy hoistway door. Then she reached inside and slid open the metal car gate. After that, she grabbed her huge package and began the difficult process of trying to push it inside the elevator car. It was immediately clear that the only way this 7-foot-tall box was going to fit inside the small elevator was if she got it in there at an angle, standing upright. But no matter how hard she pushed and pulled and twisted it, she just could not get the box to go inside. While Carrie was struggling with this, another tenant happened to walk in through the front doors of the apartment building. He saw Carrie struggling with the box. At first, he just walked past her and started heading up the stairs towards his own apartment. But then he stopped, turned around, and said to Carrie, "Hey, I don't think it's a good idea to keep doing what you're doing. That package looks like it's too heavy for that elevator." He explained that the elevator was really old and that they had had problems with it before. He warned her that she might trip a sensor and the elevator might start moving before she was ready. He told her it just wasn't worth the risk. Carrie, who was already pretty committed to getting this done, hesitated for a second. She looked at her package, then looked back up at the man and said, "You know what? I'm just going to try one more time to get it inside the elevator." Seeing her determination, the other tenant hesitated for a moment and then decided to help her. He went back down the stairs and held open the heavy hoistway door with his hand. Carrie then stepped inside the elevator car and used her own hip to keep the inner car gate from closing. Working together, the two of them began pushing and pulling, and finally, after a lot of effort, they were able to wedge the package at an angle inside the elevator car. Carrie thanked the man for his help and he said, "No problem." Then he turned and walked up the stairs and disappeared from view. Once he was gone, Carrie didn't press any of the floor buttons. Instead, she tried to close the inner car gate over the top of her package. But at the same time, down in the basement, a maintenance worker hit the call button for the elevator. Unbeknownst to Carrie, when she and the other tenant had wedged her huge package inside the elevator, the very top of the box had pressed up against a safety sensor at the top of the door frame. This sensor was the one that registered when the car gate was fully shut. So, when the maintenance worker in the basement pressed the call button, the elevator system was tricked. Because the package was pressing on that sensor, the elevator thought the inner gate was shut and secured and that it was time to move. And so, the car began to descend towards the basement. But it only made it a couple of feet before the movement caused the package to slip off of the sensor. The moment the box was no longer pressing on the sensor, the elevator's safety system kicked in and the car stopped abruptly. Carrie was most likely very confused about how the car could have moved at all, considering the inner car gate was still wide open. But she had bigger problems now. She was trapped in the elevator, stuck between the first-floor lobby and the basement. She didn't panic, though. She decided she would just try to get her package fully back inside the elevator car, and then she would figure out what to do next. When the package had slipped off the sensor, it had fallen forward and was now jutting out of the elevator. The top half of the box was in the first-floor lobby, propped up against the floor. So Carrie turned around so her back was facing the opening of the elevator. She got down into a squatting position underneath her package, put her shoulder up against it, and then began pressing it upwards as hard as she could. She managed to press the package back up and inside of the car. But once again, the top of that package made contact with that same sensor that registers whether the gate is shut. And so, believing it was shut and secure, the elevator began moving down again. This time, Carrie, whose back was to the opening of the elevator, lost her balance. She fell backwards out of the moving elevator and into the narrow, dark space between the outside of the elevator car and the inside of the elevator shaft wall. Now, if the elevator had not been moving, she probably could have just crawled back up into the elevator. But unfortunately, her package did not slip off the sensor this time. It stayed firmly pressed against it. And so, the elevator still believed the gate was shut, and it kept on moving down towards the basement. As soon as Carrie fell into this narrow space, the downward movement of the elevator would have pulled her into that space, crushing her up against the inside of the elevator shaft wall as the heavy car forced its way down past her. But the car didn't even make it all the way to the basement. It stopped once Carrie's body was pinned perfectly between the elevator car and the elevator shaft walls. When the fire department finally arrived, it was far too late. Carrie was already deceased. On Thanksgiving morning in the year 1900, one 8-year-old named Thomas Pedler told his mother that he was just going out for a little bit, but that he would definitely be back in time for the turkey dinner that afternoon. Then he grabbed his jacket and his coat and headed out the door. Thomas lived in a very working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, California. It was the kind of place where, generally speaking, nothing big or exciting ever really happened. It was a neighborhood where people just worked hard, and that was about it. But on this particular day, something huge was happening in Thomas's neighborhood. The big annual football game between Stanford University and the University of California was taking place at the stadium right in Thomas's district. They were expecting over 20,000 people to cram into that stadium. Thomas was not about to miss this incredible spectacle, even though he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket. He was determined that he would find a way to watch this game. So Thomas left his house and ran to the stadium, which was not far from where he lived. He waited in front of the main gate where all these people were streaming in to get into the stadium. Around 11:00 the morning, Thomas's very close friend Charles, who was also a young man, made his way to the front gate. The two met up, and at first, their plan was to try to sneak in with the huge horde of people that were making their way into the stadium. But even though they were still hours away from the opening kickoff of the big game, which was at 2:30 inches the afternoon, the stadium was already completely packed. There was literally nowhere to sit, and there was nowhere to stand. Even people who had tickets and were going in were looking around, wondering where on earth they were going to watch the game from. So Thomas and Charles realized, what's the point of sneaking in if there's nowhere to even see the field? They decided they needed to find another way to watch this game. They began looking around the outside of the stadium, and they noticed there was a huge fence that lined the entire perimeter of the stadium. They saw that some people had already climbed up onto this fence, trying to get a view down onto the field. Thomas and Charles decided they would try to do that too, but they quickly saw that all the good spots on the fence were already taken. The few spots that were still open provided absolutely no view of the field. So that option didn't work either. Thomas and Charles were getting frustrated. They were starting to worry that they were going to miss the big game entirely. But as they walked back over to the front gates of the stadium, they happened to notice a group of people across the street. This group was rushing over to a big white brick factory building. They were literally placing ladders up against the sides of this building and beginning to climb up it. This was a 5-story building, and people were just free climbing the windows and the fire escapes to get to the top. Thomas and Charles realized that the roof of this factory was flat and that it provided a perfect, unobstructed view down onto the football field. All of these people were trying to get a good seat to watch the game. Without any hesitation, Thomas and Charles decided they were going to do the same thing. They left the stadium, ran across the street, and began climbing up the ladders, scrambling up the windows and the fire escapes, until, finally, they made it onto the roof, 55 feet off the ground. When they got up there weren't that many people yet. So Thomas and Charles were able to run right over to the front edge of the building and claim a spot with an absolutely perfect view of the game. A couple of hours later, at 2:30 inches the afternoon, when the game actually started, the rooftop that Thomas and Charles were on was now completely packed with people. Hundreds of people had climbed up onto this factory. There had been some factory workers down below telling people not to do this, yelling that it wasn't safe to climb on top of the factory. But nobody listened to them. And the police either didn't notice what was happening or they just didn't care. So, there were all these people on this roof. They were all super excited, and the game had finally begun. As soon as the game started, the crowd inside the stadium, which could be heard very easily from the rooftop, just erupted. There were bands playing in the stadium, and the sound was incredible. It was chaos down below, and that chaotic energy really caught on up on the roof. All the men, including Thomas and Charles, were getting amped up about the game. They were singing, they were chanting, they were screaming, they were yelling. It was total chaos, and Thomas and Charles loved every second of it. But about 20 minutes into the game, as Thomas and Charles were enjoying themselves and the crowd was still going wild, a dull cracking sound could be heard coming from one side of the roof. Thomas and Charles kind of spun around to see where this cracking sound had come from. When they began looking out across the sea of people on the roof, they noticed that on the far side of the roof, where the sounds seemed to have come from, people were scrambling, trying to get off the roof. But before Thomas and Charles and the other people around them who were watching this happen could figure out what was going on, there was a much louder cracking sound. And suddenly, the floor underneath Thomas, Charles, and everybody else on that roof collapsed. Immediately, people on the roof fell all the way to the bottom of this factory 55 feet below. There weren't a lot of different floors inside of this factory. Instead, it was basically just one big 55-foot-high building that housed a massive brick structure right in the center. This brick structure was almost as tall as the entire factory itself. It was almost like the factory was just a shell built around this smaller 40-foot-tall brick structure in the middle. So, after the ceiling collapsed, Thomas fell. But miraculously, he landed on a wooden support beam that stretched across the entire factory. He managed to grab onto it, saving himself from falling all the way down. So, Thomas only fell about 5 feet, and he was okay. But he didn't have a great grip on this beam. He was holding on, but just barely. Thomas turned and looked around at what had happened below him. He could hear people screaming, and he could hear the sounds of people running around on the ground floor, trying to help those who had hit the bottom. Thomas immediately began scanning the chaos for his friend Charles, and he found him. Charles was one of the other fairly lucky people. At least in Thomas's mind, Charles seemed lucky. Instead of falling from the roof all the way to the ground, Charles and about 15 or 20 other people had fallen right onto that big brick structure that made up the main part of the factory. So, Charles had only fallen maybe 10 or 15 feet onto the structure. Thomas was thinking, oh, Charles and these other people, they've survived the fall. They're okay. However, the second that Charles and the others who had supposedly been saved by landing on this brick structure hit it, despite not suffering catastrophic injuries like broken bones, these people on the brick structure began letting out these primal, blood-curdling screams. And as they did, loud popping sounds began coming from their bodies. Then, their bodies began contorting forward, almost like a bug rolling up onto itself. It would turn out this factory was not a normal factory. This was a glass factory. And in order to make glass, you need to heat sand and other chemicals up to extraordinarily high temperatures. You need a furnace that can literally burn hotter than lava. And so that huge brick structure that was housed in the middle of this 5-story tall factory was a glass furnace. And it was on. Even though the inside of this furnace was the hottest place, at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the outside of this furnace, where Charles and the others had landed, was still extremely hot. It was so hot that the factory workers couldn't even go near the furnace, even with special protective equipment on. The only way they could work with this furnace was by using long metal pokers to work the flames and the glass from a distance. So, the instant that Charles and the others landed on the top of this furnace, they began to light on fire. Those snapping sounds that were coming from their bodies was the sound of them instantly igniting. Thomas and the others who had initially survived this horrible collapse could only watch in horror as Charles and the others shrieked, and their bodies continued to contort as they burned and smoldered. Charles's body rolled up so tightly that he began to roll down the curved side of the furnace. At some point, his body slipped into a crack in the furnace, and he actually fell into the flames inside, at which point he finally went silent. Around the time that Charles and the others stopped shrieking, a number of people who were just out on the road heard the commotion and came running inside. One of them was Thomas's father. In a terrible twist of fate, he looked up and saw his son Thomas clinging to that beam. But it was so hot inside the factory that Thomas was sweating profusely. He was losing his grip, and it was getting really hard to hold on to the beam. And his father watched as Thomas lost his grip and fell the remaining 10 feet down onto the furnace exterior. He landed feet first, then he fell onto his stomach and his face. He immediately ignited on fire, began shrieking, and then he too went silent. All told, 23 people would be killed during this roof collapse, and dozens more would be horribly injured and disfigured. This collapse goes down as one of the very worst disasters in sports history. However, on this day, the crowd inside the stadium was so caught up in the game that they actually didn't notice this horrible tragedy taking place just 100 feet away from where they were. It wasn't until the end of the game, when the winning team's fans carried their players out of the stadium in a kind of spontaneous victory parade, that they walked out onto the street and saw all the burnt, rolled-up corpses of the people who had landed on the furnace. In 1996, a 21-year-old named Katie Fleming was studying French at the University of Oregon. That summer, she was invited to go on a camping trip with some very close friends and some people she had not met before. Their destination was a beautiful spot along the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California. But as soon as they got there, Katie didn't take in any of the beautiful scenery. Instead, her attention was fixated solely on a 25-year-old named James Kim, who was one of those people she had not met before on the trip. For the people who were on that trip, they would later say that James and Katie just immediately fell in love with each other. For the entire duration of the trip, they were completely inseparable. And when they got back from the trip, James actually moved from Seattle, Washington, down to Oregon to be with Katie. After Katie graduated from college, the two of them got married in Las Vegas and then settled down in San Francisco. James, who had always loved technology, was quickly hired by a major tech company. His job was to try out new technology and then write reviews for the average consumer. Basically, James got paid to play with the latest toys, and he absolutely loved his job. The couple also opened two of their own boutique stores in San Francisco. One was an apothecary, and the other sold eccentric clothing. Those two shops were managed full-time by Katie. By 2006, the Kim family had become very successful financially, and they had also grown in size. They now had a 4-year-old daughter named Penelope and a 7-month-old daughter named Sabine. Katie and James both adored their kids, but James especially was known for blowing off virtually everything and anyone just to be with his daughters. In fact, his friends and family would say you couldn't even have a conversation with James if his daughters were in the same room. He would just get distracted and stare at his daughters, and then he would eventually just leave the conversation hand mid-sentence to go play with them. James was also known to bring his daughters to work with him virtually every chance he got, even if it wasn't really allowed at his company. On Friday, November 17th, James, Katie, and their two daughters loaded up into their station wagon and then drove north to Seattle. They planned on spending the Thanksgiving holiday with James's aunt and uncle who lived in the city. Also, James and Katie were considering leaving San Francisco and moving somewhere else, and Seattle seemed like a natural landing spot for them. So, this trip served two purposes: a chance to see family and a chance to explore the area. Late on that Friday night, after a very long drive, they finally arrived in Seattle. For the next couple of days, they had a wonderful time visiting with family and having a big Thanksgiving dinner. On Friday, November 24th, the day after Thanksgiving, James, Katie, and their daughters loaded back up into their station wagon early in the morning. They said goodbye to James's aunt and uncle, and then they hit the road. But instead of just driving straight all the way back to San Francisco, which would have taken the entire day and then some, they decided to make a stop in Portland, Oregon. One of Katie's very close friends from college was going to meet them there for lunch. After about a 4-hour drive, they arrived in Portland, met up with Katie's friend, and had a nice lunch. Afterwards, the family retired to a hotel where they crashed for the night. The next morning, the original plan was to just get in the car and drive all the way back to San Francisco. But Katie suggested to James that instead of just driving all day, they should stay in Portland for part of the day, leave in the afternoon, and then stop somewhere between Portland and home. They would break up the long drive one more time. James thought it was a great idea. They pulled out a map, and Katie found a nice, family-friendly vacation spot that was almost exactly halfway between where they were and their home in San Francisco. It was called the 22-Ton Lodge, and it was located on the coast of Oregon in a town called Gold Beach. James and Katie thought it was perfect. This was exactly what they needed. Katie called the lodge and made reservations for that night. That afternoon, after the family had spent a nice day in Portland, they hopped back in the car and began traveling south towards the lodge. At about 8:30 inches the evening, the family was still on the road making their way when James got really hungry and said they should pull over and get a bite to eat. So, the family pulled over at a Denny's restaurant in Central Oregon. They went inside, and after a quick meal, they got back out on the road at 9 p.m. From the Denny's, it was about a 2.5-hour drive to the lodge. But after driving for 2 more hours, James realized that they had missed a turn somewhere. He told Katie about it, they looked at the map, and they realized that if they were to backtrack all the way to that missed turn, it would add several more hours onto their trip. So, they began looking for an alternative path, and they found one. Instead of going all the way west to the coast and then all the way south to the lodge, which was their original plan, they could just go south from where they currently were until they were parallel with the lodge. And then from there, they could just cut west along a road called Bear Camp Road. It looked like it would go straight to their destination. But what this map did not do a good job of explaining was just how dangerous Bear Camp Road was. It started at an elevation of 900 feet, but it very quickly climbed all the way up to 4,000 feet of elevation before it went over the backside of a mountain and down to Gold Beach, where the lodge was. While the road is paved, it's incredibly narrow, and it's basically cut into the side of a mountain. This means there are very steep drop-offs throughout most of the drive, and there are no guardrails protecting people from falling off the edge. The summer is really the only time people should be on Bear Camp Road because that's when the road is maintained. In the winter, the road is not plowed, it's not maintained at all, and so even a light snowstorm could make the road totally impassable. And the road cuts through a very remote section of Oregon where there just aren't many people around. So, if you get into trouble out there, you are probably on your own. But the Kims were not aware of any of the dangers this road possessed. So, after going south for a while, they did turn onto Bear Camp Road and began slowly driving up the mountain. As James was driving, Katie fell asleep in the passenger seat and the girls fell asleep in the back. Outside, it began to snow. An hour later, Katie woke up from her sleep. The first thing she noticed was that it was now snowing so hard outside that James had the windshield wipers on full blast, and you could still barely see out the front windshield. She looked at her husband, and he was hunched over the steering wheel, his knuckles white, looking intently out the window. She asked him, "What's going on?" "Should we stop? Should we turn around?" James, without even looking at her, said, "Yeah, honey, I do want to turn around, but the road is so narrow, we can't." Then he told his wife that earlier, they had actually driven through a fork in the road where there was enough space to turn around, and so now he was just hopeful that there would be another fork somewhere up ahead that would allow them to do the same. Katie was not excited about this idea, but she trusted James, and she said, "Okay, let's keep going." So James just continued driving up this mountain pass. And you have to understand, they were driving on what was basically a cliff. On the left side, to James's left, was just a sheer drop-off, and the road was totally slick from the snow. Periodically, as James was driving, even though he was only going about 5 miles per hour, the car would begin to slip and slide right on the edge of this cliff. It was a very, very stressful ride. After several more miles of this, they still hadn't reached any kind of turnaround. In fact, they would have to periodically stop on inclines, put on the emergency brake, and one of them would have to get out of the car and clear branches and rocks out of this tiny little road just to continue onward. Finally, Katie said to James, "You have to stop. You have to back out of here. That's our only choice right now." So James put the car in reverse, and he opened his car door so he could look down at the edge of the cliff to make sure he didn't accidentally veer off of it. Very slowly, without even applying the gas, he began backing up, making sure he didn't go off the cliff. They did this for hours and hours. It must have been unbelievably stressful. But finally, they made it back to that fork in the road that James had seen much earlier. And now, they had a decision to make. They had two paths they could take. They could turn around completely and drive nose out along the path they came in on, all the way back to the highway. But that was a very long drive, and they knew that road was treacherous with its cliff drop-off. It was really just as dangerous as what they had just been on, and they were not keen to be on that road again considering the weather. Or they could turn left and go down the mountain on a path that was way wider than the one they had been on. It looked like a huge road, and it seemed to go straight to the bottom of the mountain. They were thinking, we don't know where this goes. The signage isn't clear. But you have to figure if you're going lower in elevation, the weather won't be as bad. And maybe if we go down this road, there will be houses, or a gas station, or something. Whatever it is, it's probably better than going back the way we came. So James turned the car and began driving down this new road. Unfortunately, this was the worst choice they could have made. This road they were now on was a long, winding dead end that was used by loggers in the summer. Normally, this mistake by the Kim family would have been caught, because there was supposed to be a big yellow gate that sat across this road just a little ways past the fork, blocking all traffic from going any further. But vandals had recently come up and cut the lock on this gate, swung it open, and then locked it in the open position. So, the gate was completely off the road. As the Kims drove past the spot where they normally would have been stopped, they didn't even see a gate. There was no gate anywhere, so they just kept on driving. From where this gate should have been, the road went from paved to dirt, full of potholes, and it narrowed considerably. The couple drove for 15 miles on this very tight, winding road that once again was on a cliffside. Finally, they reached another fork in the road where they could either go right or go straight, but there was no sign telling them which way led to what. James stopped the car right in the middle of this intersection, and he and Katie looked at each other. They knew they were in trouble. They got their phones out and tried to call for help, but they had no service. As they were struggling to place calls, one of them realized that it was no longer snowing. It was actually raining, and a lot of the snow on the ground seemed to be getting washed away. After not being able to place any calls for several minutes, they decided, you know what? It's 2 o'clock in the morning. We're tired. Let's just sleep here. We'll leave the car running so it'll be nice and warm. And when we wake up in the morning, this rain will most likely have washed away all the snow, and we can just drive out of here. The two of them were kind of relieved as they said this out loud. The situation wasn't nearly as bad as it seemed. They would be just fine. So Katie, James, and their 2 daughters fell asleep with the car running, nice and warm. But when they woke up, Katie and James realized their situation had gotten much, much worse. At some point in the night after they had fallen asleep, the temperature must have dropped again, and that rain had turned into very heavy snow. All the water on the ground had frozen, and then almost a foot of new snow had fallen on top of it. They were completely and totally stuck. But Katie and James didn't panic. They remembered that when they first turned onto Bear Camp Road, they had seen a snowplow truck parked off on the side of the road. To them, that meant that if it snowed along Bear Camp Road, the road would get plowed. So that day, the Kims just stayed inside their car. They ate snacks, they read books, they kept the heater on, and they waited to be rescued. But over the course of that entire day, nobody came down that road. No plows, no anybody. Katie and James continuously tried their cell phones, trying to get a signal to call for help, but they never had any service. They also continuously honked the horn in case someone was in the area who might hear them, but no one ever came to their rescue. By the end of that Sunday night, Katie and James were really starting to get worried. They had a 4-year-old and a 7-month-old. They could not be out here for very much longer. But they began to tell each other, you know what? It's Sunday. Maybe the plows don't come through on Sundays. Maybe they just don't work out here on the weekend. They convinced themselves that tomorrow, Monday, the plows would be out, they would come by, and they would save them. They also reassured each other that tomorrow, Monday, was the day they were supposed to be back in San Francisco. People were bound to notice their absence, report it to the police, and a search party would come out and save them. So tomorrow, they were going to get found. That night, Katie and James put their 2 daughters in their car seats, and James read them some bedtime stories. Then the family fell asleep. The next day, Monday, the family did a lot of the same things they did the day before. They sat in their car, they tried to keep their spirits high, they tried to use their cell phones, which didn't work. They honked their horns to get people's attention, which didn't work. They tried to ration their food, and the whole time they kept their eyes on each side of the road, hoping a plow would come through. But all day long, no trucks, no plows, nothing came down the road. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family's absence was noticed by a family friend, but they didn't report it to the police because they just figured the Kim family had decided to stay out a little bit longer and would be back soon. By Monday night, Katie and James were officially terrified. They were almost out of fuel for their car, and they were almost out of food. In fact, to compensate for their low amount of food, Katie had begun not only breastfeeding her 7-month-old, but also her 4-year-old. Also, outside of their car, bears began to assemble and check them out. At first, Katie and James would scream and yell to try to scare them off, but the bears ultimately were not that fazed by them. They weren't aggressive, but it meant the family did not feel comfortable getting out of their car. They were in this very claustrophobic situation, literally trapped inside this small car where all the windows were covered with snow. They couldn't go anywhere, they couldn't call anyone, and they were running out of supplies. It was a terrifying situation to be in. Katie and James had been really strong up to this point, but around this time, they began to act scared, and their kids picked up on it and started acting scared and fearful too. The parents were trying their best to calm them down and tell them everything was going to be fine, and they were going to get out of here soon. But in reality, Katie and James knew that if they didn't get found soon, they were probably going to die. The next day, when they woke up, which was Tuesday, again, no cars or trucks came down either road. There were no plows. The snow just continued to pile up, and their food was running unbelievably low. At one point, James actually left the car and went out looking for bear droppings because there were bears all over the place now. He would pull the undigested berries out of their droppings, and he and Katie began eating those. But after a while, they decided that was not a good idea because they might poison themselves. Their daughters, who the day before had been acting out of fear and anxiety, were now lethargic and quiet. The parents' response to this was to start fighting with each other about whose fault this was, when in reality, they were just totally scared about what might happen to them. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family had still not been reported to the police. And so that night, Tuesday night, the Kim family once again huddled up inside of their car. James read the kids some books, and then they all fell asleep. The next morning, Wednesday, they ran out of gas for their car. And so they had no way to heat themselves. James got the spare tire out of the back of the car, rounded up some magazines they had, and he lit a fire for the family to stand around and try to warm up by. It worked, but the fire very quickly died out, and they couldn't find any wood that wasn't soaking wet to put on it. Before long, they did not have a fire. All day that day, James and Katie were desperately looking up the road, hoping that a car or truck would come through. They never did. James and Katie tried their cell phones repeatedly, but they never got service. They honked their horns and screamed for help, but nobody heard them. Before long, it was dark again, and the family was huddled up inside their now freezing car. All they could hear outside was the sound of bears marching around the area. I'm sure James and Katie thought to themselves, I wonder if we'll survive the night. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, that family friend who had noticed the Kims were gone on Monday finally went to the police on Wednesday afternoon and reported them missing. A search party was being organized that night, but of course the Kim family would have no way of knowing that. The next morning, Thursday, the Kim family woke up. They had survived the night. But at this point, James and Katie were speaking openly about the real possibility that they all might die. In fact, Katie said to James, "You have to promise me, if our two kids die out here, you have to kill me too." And James said he would. At this point, Katie and James did not believe a truck or a car or anything was going to drive down this road and save them. They believed their only hope of being rescued was by sending a smoke signal up into the air that a pilot might see. So, they pulled off all 4 tires of their car. Then, they pulled everything out of the car that might burn and stacked it on the tires. That included Penelope's prized stuffed lamb. Once they had their big pile, they lit it on fire. Fairly quickly, a large, black, billowing cloud of smoke was going straight up into the sky. For a minute, the Kim family was very optimistic that they were about to be found. Surely, someone was going to see this smoke and come find them. But unfortunately, the fire burned out very quickly. They couldn't light it again, and nobody flew overhead. Before long, the family was once again huddled inside their freezing cold car that night. There were bears walking around outside. They were basically out of food. Their kids weren't even crying anymore. They were just silent and cold and miserable. As they were all shivering and trying to stay warm, James realized he needed to do something drastic, or his family was going to die. The next morning, Friday, when they got up, James told Katie that he had been studying the map. He said there was a town about 4 miles to the east called Gallus that he believed he could get to in about 2 hours. Katie immediately said, "No, you cannot leave us. We need you here. There's probably a search party out there looking for us right now. We need to stay together so we can all be found." But James's instincts were telling him that no one was coming for them, or at least no one was going to actually find them in time. Their only hope was if he ventured off and found help. Katie finally, reluctantly, agreed to let him go because he seemed so confident. At 7:45 inches the morning, James gave his 2 daughters a big hug and a kiss, told them he loved them and that he would see them soon. Then he hugged his wife and said he loved her. And then he turned around and walked up the road out of sight. At the same time, unbeknownst to the Kim family, hundreds of searchers and multiple helicopters were now all over Bear Camp Road looking for them. 2 days later, on Sunday, December 3rd, a full week after the family had originally gotten stuck, a helicopter pilot that was part of the search effort was flying around Bear Camp Road when he noticed footprints in the snow below. He started following these footprints. Eventually, the footprints disappeared under some trees, and he couldn't pick them up again. Without much fuel left, he decided he would just backtrack and follow the footprints back to their origin. He retraced these footprints for quite a while until he came to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a car. And next to the car was Katie, waving an umbrella back and forth. The pilot immediately knew who he was looking at, but he didn't have enough fuel to actually land and pick her and her family up. So instead, he just hovered down as low as he could and made good eye contact with her to reassure her, "I see you and we're coming for you." Then he marked their location on his map. He flew off to the search headquarters, and just minutes later, another helicopter was sent up. They flew to that same location and were able to land in the clearing. As soon as the pilot got out, he saw Katie running up to him, carrying her 2 daughters, who looked like they were in pretty good shape. She was crying tears of joy and thanking him profusely. Then, when she was right up in front of him, she said, "Are you here because of my husband?" "Did James tell you where we were?" The pilot looked visibly confused. Katie picked up on it, and she explained how just 2 days earlier, James had left to go to the town of Gallus to get help, and he still hadn't come back yet. At this point, the pilot understood what was happening. He looked down and said, "No, ma'am. We still have not found James." Katie was devastated. She cried as she and her daughters were loaded into the helicopter, airlifted out of the forest, and brought to a hospital. There, they would all make full recoveries. Meanwhile, the search effort, which had been spread all over Bear Camp Road, was suddenly focused exclusively on the area around where their car was found. Professional trackers were brought in to look for James's tracks. They found them fairly quickly and began following them. After leaving his family to go look for help, which must have been the most difficult decision he had ever made in his entire life, James had walked 3 miles up the road they came in on. Then, instead of continuing on that road in the direction of Gallus, he deviated and walked off the road. He went straight down one of the cliffs until he hit a river. It's believed that maybe he saw the river from up on the road and thought that it would be a faster way to get to town. As he walked, he would leave behind him little bits of torn clothing and torn paper to create a trail of where he was going, presumably so he could backtrack to his family if he needed to. He got down to this river, and for several miles he walked downstream. After being gone for at least 2 hours and not reaching the town of Gallus, he must have realized he had either gone the wrong way or he had miscalculated the distance. But either way, he did not turn around and go back to his family. Instead, he pressed on, believing he was their only hope. On he went, crossing over rivers, getting totally soaked in frigid water. He went up and down mountains all over these totally rugged areas in nothing but street clothes. He had on sneakers, pants, and a jacket. He had no food and no water. He just kept on going until it was nightfall. He had covered about 10 miles at this point. He laid down and he went to sleep. That night must have been absolutely horrible as he thought about his family, alone in the woods somewhere. He probably wondered if they were still alive. The temperature was in the 30s, and again, he was just in street clothes. But he survived the night. The next morning, that Saturday, he got up and he was right back at it, despite the fact that he was physically wrecked at this point. But for him, he didn't care. He was doing it for his family. All day, he hiked in and out of freezing cold streams, up and down mountains, until finally, he found himself at the bottom of a deep ravine next to a river. He just fell to his knees, fell forward, and died. He had literally just kept on going, looking for help for his family, until he eventually succumbed to hypothermia. James's body was located 2 days after his wife and his daughters were successfully rescued. It would turn out the town of Gallus was not 4 miles away from the family's car. It was about 15 miles away. But that's as the crow flies, from point A to point B on a map in a straight line. When you're actually hiking in the wilderness, you don't go in straight lines because there are mountains and rivers and things that get in the way. In order to get to Gallus from where their car was, James would have had to travel 30 or 40 miles, zigging and zagging up over 4 different mountains. It was a suicide mission from the start. James ultimately covered 16 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain in the country, wearing nothing but his street clothes. The professional trackers that followed his 16-mile trail to his body called his journey superhuman. The helicopter pilot would later say he never would have found Katie and the girls had he not spotted those footprints first and then traced them all the way back to that clearing. And it would turn out those footprints were made by James after he left his family and walked off to get help. And so, even though it cost him his life, James did ultimately save his family. In Moscow, Russia, a group of friends rented out a private section of a spa that included a steam room and a small indoor pool. After the reservations were made, an influencer named Yekaterina Didenko and all of her influencer friends began eagerly talking about how excited they were for this party on their various social media accounts. When the day finally came, February 28th, which was Didenko's birthday, she, her husband, and the 8 other people they invited all descended on the spa. They went inside to their private area, and it was great. There was food, there was alcohol, there was music. They were jumping into the pool, getting in the hot tub, and everyone was just having a great time. Everyone was taking pictures and filming and live streaming. It was going as well as it possibly could be. At some point, Didenko's husband signaled to the rest of the group, minus Didenko, and they all began to pull out these white hazardous material suits. Imagine what you would see in a movie if there was some huge chemical leak, a full-body white suit with a mask. They all started putting on these hazmat suits, and they gave one to Didenko, who put it on as well. They told her this was part of her big surprise. Now, it's unclear if Didenko actually didn't know what was going to happen next, or if she was just pretending to be surprised because it would look better on social media. This was all being filmed, and she was an influencer after all. Either way, she put on her hazmat suit. Once everyone had their suits on, Didenko's husband wheeled in a huge cooler, the kind you would bring to a picnic, and he placed it right on the edge of the pool. When he opened the lid, the crowd all gasped and laughed and smiled and filmed as huge clouds of white smoke or steam came pouring out of it. What it was roughly 55 pounds of dry ice. Dry ice is just frozen carbon dioxide. It's commonly used for things like refrigerating perishable goods for long periods of time because dry ice stays cold for a really long time. Also, because of the huge white gas clouds that come off of it, it's very commonly used as a sort of spooky decoration. And that's what Didenko's husband planned to use this dry ice for. He was going to dump it into the pool to create those big white gas clouds all over the surface of the water. They call it dry ice because as it starts to heat up, it doesn't melt into a liquid state the way frozen water does. Instead, it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state. Dry ice is considered to be quite hazardous if it's handled inappropriately. And while these partygoers all had their hazmat suits on, it's unlikely they were actually wearing them for safety. It's far more likely they were wearing them because it would look good on social media and would kind of hype up the stunt they were about to do. After the dry ice was revealed inside the cooler, Didenko's husband and another one of the partygoers grabbed the sides of the cooler and they dumped its entire contents directly into the water. As soon as the dry ice hit the water, it rapidly began to warm up, which caused a massive, almost explosive release of carbon dioxide gas that completely filled the lower half of the room. None of the partygoers were even a little bit fazed by what was happening. They didn't realize how dangerous this actually was. They were just filming and laughing and thinking this was so cool. Then Didenko's husband actually leaped through the cloud of gas into the water and disappeared below the surface. Shortly after that, 2 other partygoers also leaped into the pool. One of the main reasons dry ice is considered to be so hazardous if handled inappropriately is because it emits carbon dioxide gas, which at high concentrations will displace oxygen. So imagine if you're in a very small room that has very poor ventilation. If you had a lot of carbon dioxide in there, you would suffocate. This indoor pool area was a small, confined space with poor ventilation. So, the 7 people who were still on the pool deck shortly after the dry ice had been tossed into the pool started to realize it was really hard to breathe. The oxygen was basically being sucked out of the room. They were able to turn and actually run out of the pool deck area before it was too late. Meanwhile, Didenko's husband and the other 2 people who had leaped into the pool, when they came back to the surface, they took a breath, thinking they would be breathing in oxygen. But instead, they breathed in an entire lungful of concentrated carbon dioxide. In addition to displacing oxygen, at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation, carbon dioxide is also poisonous. So, when the 3 of them surfaced, they breathed in this poisonous gas. This caused 2 of them to immediately pass out and then die right there in the water. The 3rd person, Didenko's husband, managed to stay conscious enough that he was able to barely climb out of the pool. He tried to get to the door, but he couldn't get out in time. Eventually, he was pulled out and rushed to the hospital, but he would later die, not only from carbon dioxide poisoning, but also from having gone without oxygen for as long as he had. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.